Hey everybody, Mr. Bruss here. I just want to recap what we talked about in biology today on Tuesday, February 2nd. And this was kind of our piece that I got a little ahead of myself on the stuff that I had originally assigned. And I realized we need sort of this transition piece from this overview of genetics to the sort of problem solving that happens in Punnett squares. And there's a little bit of vocabulary and just kind of recognizing symbols that we need to use that's going to make the rest of the unit make a lot more sense more quickly. I think everybody would have gotten it eventually, but I wanted to take today to kind of bridge us over to the more of the problem solving. So I'm going to kind of reenact what we talked about in class today. And hopefully you can use this as a video to prepare you for the rest of the unit. So I'm going to share my iPad screen here, and I'm going to work out a notability. So here we are. Today we started in notability, and we started with our narrative guide that we had been working on because I wanted to highlight one piece of that. And we specifically started with this kind of this karyotype showing the pairs of chromosomes, and then this blow up version showing gene locus. The same spot on each chromosome has a given gene. And what I did is I just clicked on the scissors tool and just cut this piece out, copied that, and then backed out of Notability and went up here to start a new note. And then I just tapped in here and pasted that image in. And then we can kind of just blow this up and start from here. Okay. So what we talked about is that humans, this is a human karyotype, have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and 22 of those are numbered, 1 through 22. And then one pair is a special pair that comes either XX or XY to determine biological sex. And what we had talked about is that in the pairs of chromosomes that we have in every single one of our cells, one of those chromosomes came from mom and one came from dad. I'm just saying randomly, I don't know. There's nothing to indicate to me that this came from the mother or this one came from the father. I'm just using that to indicate that one chromosome came from mom, one came from dad. One other thing we talked about previously was that in these chromosomes, that positions in the chromosomes from mom and from dad match up exactly, such that the same gene is at the same position in each of the chromosomes. And it doesn't mean that it's the same exact version of the gene, but the same gene. And one example might be down here, this is showing that the same gene is at the same position. And this gene here maybe is for eye color, potentially. And what we show is that maybe if we blow up, that we know actually in humans that on chromosome 15, that there is a position or a locus means a spot on the chromosome, that is the gene for eye color. And in our simplified world here, we're saying that the gene can come in two different flavors, two different versions. There is a blue version and there is a brown version. So that's kind of that gets us started. So when we're talking about inheritance, we're talking about getting these a chromosome from mom, chromosome from dad that carries with it the gene for eye color. And one thing that we also mentioned is that each chromosome has approximately 1,000 genes on it. And we're just focusing on one of those at a time, in this case, eye color. And that the entire genome in humans carries approximately 20,000 genes. Okay, so the other thing is that when we're talking about this inheritance pattern, we know we get one copy of a gene from mom and one copy of a gene from dad. And then we would say, what would be the eye color here? And one word that we're going to look is the trait. We call this the phenotype. This is the version that you get, the trait that you get. And that'll become clear in just a sec. So what we could say is, well, maybe we got the version of brown eyes from our mom and the version of brown eyes from our dad. Or we could have gotten brown eyes, a version of the brown eye gene from our mom, and a version of the blue eye gene from our dad. Another possibility is we could have gotten the blue-eyed version of the gene from our mom and the brown-eyed version of the gene from our dad. Or the final is we got a blue-eyed version of the gene from our mom and a blue-eyed version of the gene from our dad. Now, just without even really knowing much about the details of genetics, you might be able to figure out that, well, if I got the brown-eyed version of the gene from my mom and the brown-eyed version of the gene from my dad, well, my eyes are probably going to be brown. And if I got, maybe we'll make this brown here, brown. And if I get the blue-eyed version of the gene from my mom and the blue-eyed version of the gene from my dad, it might not be hard for me to imagine that I would have blue eyes. The question then, though, is what happens in the case where I get one version of the blue gene from my mom, and then the other version of brown eyes from my dad, or opposite? My chromosomes look like chromosome 15 here with one version of blue and one version of brown. What color eyes do I have then? Well, is one blue and the other brown? You don't often see that in the population, although it does happen. Is it like a sparkly combination? Is it half and half? How does it work? Well, to start off understanding genetics, we're going to focus on a process of where there's dominant and recessive genes. And the dominant and recessive means that if you have only one copy of the dominant, if you have one version of the dominant trait, it takes over. So in this case, brown eyes is the dominant trait. So if you have one version of brown and one version of blue, your eyes are going to be brown. And if you have just the same way, if you got that brown-eyed version from your dad and blue eyes from your mom, you still have one version of the dominant trait, and your eyes will be brown. So like I said in class, and like is kind of demonstrated here, scientists like to kind of be efficient when they're using their notation for this, when they're coding for this. So they don't want to have to write brown or blue or straight hair or curly hair. So what they do is they use capital and lowercase letters to indicate the capital indicates the dominant, and the lowercase indicates the recessive. So you as an individual for this trait, and remember, we're oversimplifying a little bit here, but just imagine we're living in a world where there's only brown eyes or blue eyes, and it's a single gene, and brown eyes are dominant. So in this case, brown eyes are dominant to blue. So brown eyes are big B and blue eyes are little b. So you could imagine a little more simpler notation. Here's mom, here's dad, what we got. Here is our genotype. We'll talk about that in a sec. And then our phenotype. And these will both become obvious. So, like we said before, you could have gotten the brown-eyed version of the gene from your mom and the brown-eyed version of the gene from your dad, or you could have gotten the brown-eyed version of the gene from your mom and the blue-eyed version of the gene from your dad, or blue-eyed version of the gene from your mom and the brown-eyed version of the gene from your dad, or the blue-eyed version from both your mom and your dad. And this is your genotype. So you would be either big B, big B, big B, little b, big B, or little b, little b. And what I'm doing is you can probably see that I'm just adding those up there and making this genotype. So, like we said before, well, if I have the dominant brown-eyed genotype, or sorry, I got the brown-eyed version of the gene from both my mom and the brown-eyed version of the gene from my dad. So my pair of chromosomes at that spot has 2 copies of the brown-eyed version. Well, it's probably likely you can imagine that I'd have brown eyes. The phenotype is the trait, what's being displayed, what characteristic. We also mentioned that if I had the blue-eyed version from both mom and dad, I would have blue eyes. And here's now where we show what happens if you have only one copy of the dominant gene. That takes over and your eyes are brown. You carry the recessive trait with you if you're in this, what's called heterozygous. We'll talk about that in just a sec. But your eyes are brown. So a little bit of more what's called nomenclature or wording that we have is, if we have big B, we call this homozygous dominant. Homo meaning the same, zygous coming from the zygote or having the pair of chromosomes together. So this just means it's the same chromosome. They're matching at that spot. And then we indicate that they're dominant. Little b is also homozygous, same version of the chromosome, at least at that spot, except this is homozygous recessive. So it says that they're the same, but they're both recessive. And the next one is we put big B, little b, and little b, big B into the same category, because your genetics doesn't care in this case, which if you got the blue version from mom or the brown version from dad or vice versa, it doesn't care. Your eyes are going to be brown. So we always write this one as big B, little b. We never write it little b, big B. It's just by convention we write it big B, little b. And this is called heterozygous. And this means different versions of the gene there. Hetero meaning different. So you might get a problem that's something like this as you move into your work for this unit. So you might get something that says a homozygous dominant female with brown eyes mates with a homozygous recessive male with blue eyes. And then so it usually gives you, it sets it up, and then we'll ask a question. What are the chances, or actually it's probably better if we be a little more specific. What is the probability that they have maybe a blue-eyed offspring? And remember, we're using this word offspring to mean a child or a kid, because we're going to be talking about plants. It's easier to just use the same thing. So these are what's made from the mom and the dad. So could a child, if we call it, if it's a human, but we don't want to call like a plant, like a baby plant. So we just use this word offspring. So we know a lot of information here. So it told us homozygous dominant, this first individual was homozygous dominant for brown eyes. So we know right away that brown eyes equals B, big B, it's dominant. And we got another piece of information here that says homozygous recessive with blue eyes. So we know blue eyes is little b. And then they said that they mated. So in genetics, we call this a cross. Even when we're talking about humans, we'll call it a cross. So the female was homozygous dominant. So she had brown eyes, homozygous dominant brown eyes, and crossed with a male that was homozygous recessive for blue eyes. And now what we're going to learn is how to determine what's going to happen with these offspring. And to do that, we use, and this is the mom here, and this is the dad here. It doesn't matter what order you put them in, but I just wanted to indicate that. So we create this little square that we call a Punnett square, named after Reginald Punnett, who came up with this little scheme, gosh, I don't know now, 100 years ago or so. And that really helps us determine the offspring. So each of the letters, remember that these B and B represent the versions of the gene on each of the pair of chromosomes of the mom. And also remember that when a female's eggs are formed, they only get one copy of the chromosome. They don't get both, they just get one copy. So in a sense, each of these panels here represents the likelihood or the possibility of what one of this female's eggs, what version of the gene they would have. In this case, it's pretty straightforward. we see big B goes there, and the big B goes there. And the same goes for the male. His sperm are only going to have one copy of the chromosome. They're not going to have both versions. So this indicates what are the probabilities, what are the possibilities that this male could have. And in that case, it's pretty straightforward. And then what we do is we just bring these together into these boxes here, and these gives us the possibilities of what the offspring would be. So this big B goes here. This little b goes here. And this big B goes here. And this little b goes here. So in this case, it's pretty straightforward. All of the offspring are going to have brown eyes, and they are going to be heterozygotes. And what gets interesting, though, is, and you might have been able to see that right off the beginning without having to make this Punnett square. But what gets a lot more interesting is, what if you cross two heterozygotes with brown eyes? So this gives you some information there. So we would have big B, little b crossed with big B, little b. And now what's this going to look like? Big B there, little b down here, big B here, little b here. And I'll just do this really quickly. These come together there. Remember, this comes here. And remember, we always write this, you could have written it as little b, big B, but just remember that we always write it as big B, little b. And the same thing would be here, big B, little b. And here is an interesting fact. These two little b's would come here, and you actually get blue eyes there. So two brown-eyed individuals could produce an offspring that has blue eyes in this case. And that's because they both carry the trait, even though it's not being displayed, because they have the other version. These other three here would be brown eyes. So in this case, 75% chance of having a brown-eyed individual and a 25% chance of having a blue-eyed child. And now that's just a chance. It's possible that this couple here, oops, I shouldn't make a blue there. Oops. It's possible that this couple here, and here, could have 10 kids, and they all could have blue eyes. It's possible. It's only a 25% chance each time. So it's really unlikely that that would happen, but it's possible. So remember that what I wanted to say is that these are just probabilities, chances that something could happen. It's not a guarantee. Just like there's a 30% chance it's going to rain, and it rains. It was just a chance, right? Or even sometimes they say it's an 80% chance and it doesn't happen. That's right, because there's 20% chance that it couldn't. These are probabilities, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. All right. So that's just what I wanted to say. That's what we talked about in class. And this is kind of transitioning us, easy for me to say, from the overall genetic picture to the schematic predicting of genes. And we just needed to learn a little bit of language and a little bit of convention there. So looking forward to seeing you all in class. And I hope this video was helpful for you.